The storm had been building since noon. By the time Delia pulled out of the parking lot of Hanover's Hardware and Feed, the sky over Route 9 had turned the colour of a bruise, and the rain was coming sideways in sheets that the wipers could barely keep up with. She gripped the wheel at 10 and 2, leaning forward in the seat the way you do when your eyes need to be closer to the windshield, even though you know it doesn't help. The heater blew lukewarm air. The right rear tyre was low. She had noticed it when she loaded the bags, and she filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept the things she couldn't fix yet. She had driven 26 miles out to Hanover's because it was the only place within an hour that still stocked the narrow-gauge wire mesh she needed for the window frames on the shop. Her own shop. A small alterations and repairs business she had been running out of the bottom floor of a rented building in Caldwell for 3 years, sewing curtains and hemming dresses and taking in the kinds of quiet domestic jobs that kept a woman busy and kept the lights on, if only barely. The shop was named Mira's Mend, and the painted script on the front window was the only thing about the place that looked like a luxury. What had happened at Hanover's was simple. The girl at the register had punched in too much for the wire roll and not enough for the staple clips, and when the receipt printed, Delia had taken her bags and walked to the car before she noticed the error. $11.40 in her favour. Not the store's fault, just a tired cashier on a Thursday afternoon, fingers pressing the wrong keys. Delia had sat in the parking lot for a moment with the receipt in one hand, and the $11.40 in change still in her coat pocket, and she had added up what she had in her checking account, and she had thought about the low tyre and the cost of a patch, and she had put the car in reverse and pulled back into the lot. She went inside and told the girl at the register what had happened. The girl had looked embarrassed and grateful in equal measure, and the manager on duty, a heavy-set man named Glenn, had come over and confirmed the transaction on the screen and nodded and said, "Thank you, ma'am," and Delia had said you're welcome and walked back out into the rain. She was 43 miles into the 50-mile drive home when the storm thickened to a near wall. She had to pull over twice on Route 9, once behind a county truck with its hazards on, once on the gravel shoulder because she simply could not see the line. Each time she turned the radio down and listened to the rain on the roof, and each time she waited until a break gave her a lane of visibility, and she pulled back on. She did not think of herself as doing anything particular. She did not think of the $11 as a test she had passed. She thought about the wire mesh and whether it would be enough to cover both frames, and she thought about whether her daughter Rena had eaten before bed. Rena was 14 and fully capable of making herself dinner, and she had done it without being asked for the past 2 years, which was its own kind of evidence of something Delia did not have a word for yet. She made it home at 8:30. The rain was still coming. She carried the bags from the trunk in 2 trips, kicking the door shut behind her, and she set them in the back of the shop and went upstairs to check on Rena. Rena was asleep with her reading light still on and a library book folded open across her chest. Delia set the book aside and turned the light off and stood in the doorway for a moment. She didn't know that a man named Vernon Hanover had been standing near the back of the store when she came in to return the money. She had not noticed him. He was the kind of man who could go unnoticed in his own store, which was a skill he had cultivated deliberately over 40 years of owning it. He wore a canvas barn coat in winter and a canvas work shirt the rest of the year, and he moved around the perimeter of the store the way a property owner does, quietly noting what needs doing, speaking when he needs to and not otherwise. He had heard Glenn call him over. He had watched the woman in the navy wool coat set $11.40 on the counter and explain the register error. He had watched her refuse the $5 credit Glenn offered, saying, No, thank you, I just wanted to be sure it was right. And he had watched her walk back out into what was by then a serious and genuine storm. Vernon was 68 years old. He had owned the store since he was 27, when his father had handed it to him with the agreement that he would pay the remaining mortgage from the operation, which he had done in full by the time he was 33. He had seen a great many things in 40 years of watching people move through his store, and he believed, with the settled conviction of a man who has had the same opinion tested repeatedly over a long time, that what a person did when they thought no one was watching was the only reliable index of their character. He stood at the window and watched the woman's car pull out and onto Route 9 and disappear into the rain. Glenn had already moved on to the next transaction. The girl at the register was zipping up her till. Vernon put his hands in his pockets and thought for a moment. He had an errand to run in Caldwell. It was not a decision that took him long. He told the closing manager he would be out, and he retrieved his truck from the lot and drove east on Route 9 into the same storm the woman had driven into. And he drove it at the same 15 miles under the posted limit, with his hazards off and his attention on the line, the way a man does when he has somewhere to be and intends to get there. The rain was bad enough on the highway that he could see where she must have had to pull over. The gravel shoulder showed tyre marks in 2 places, pale against the wet surface, and he noted them without ceremony. He had made his own drives in storms like this one, years back, following his wife to the hospital twice in weather that was worse than this. He knew what it was to make a drive that had already been decided before the conditions got harder. He recognised it when he saw someone else doing it. He did not know the woman's name. He had not thought to ask Glenn, who would have had it from the credit card transaction. He had her licence plate, which he had noted out of habit, and he had a general sense of where she had come from based on the zip code printed at the top of the receipt Glenn had pulled up on the screen. He was a man who noticed what he needed to notice. Delia did not know any of this. What she knew on Friday morning was that the wire mesh fit both frames with about an inch to spare, and that Rena had poured herself cereal before school without being asked, and that the low tyre had held overnight and she could get to the garage on her lunch break if the morning appointments held. She opened the shop at 8:30 and had 2 customers by 9, both women she knew by name, one dropping off winter coats for relining and one picking up a bridesmaid dress that had needed the zipper replaced. The morning moved at its ordinary pace. At 11, a man came in. He was older, probably late 60s, broad across the shoulders in a canvas barn coat that had seen real use. He stood just inside the door for a moment, looking at the shop the way someone looks at a room they are trying to understand. "Are you the owner?" he said. "I am," Delia said. He said he was Vernon Hanover, and he said the name the way a man says a name he is not certain means anything to anyone, which is the right way to say it. Delia looked at him. "Hanover's," she said. "Out on Route 9. "Yes, ma'am." She waited. He said, "I was in the store yesterday evening when you came back to return that money." She looked at him for another moment. She was not a woman who broadcast her reactions until she had some sense of what was coming. "You drove back in a bad storm," he said. "I had the receipt in my pocket," she said. "It wasn't right to keep it." He nodded. He said, "I drove up this morning because I wanted to meet you." There are things that take a person a moment to organise. Delia set down the seam ripper she had been holding and folded her hands on the counter. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know I didn't," he said. He told her he had owned the store for 40 years and that he had watched a lot of people discover they'd been given too much change, and that the number who came back was low enough that he could count them on one hand, and that none of them had done it in weather like last night's. He said he looked up the license plate and found the registered address, and had asked around a little, and someone at the county assessor's office had told him there was a mirrors mend alteration shop at that address, and that was where he had come. It was not a short drive for a Thursday night errand followed by a Friday morning one. Delia said, "I appreciate you saying that. I really do," he said. "I'd like to offer you something if you'll hear me." She heard him. He told her the building that sat adjacent to his property on the western side, a 2-story structure that had been a feed and grain office until the operation folded 6 years ago, had been sitting empty for most of that time. He had bought it 3 years back with no clear plan, just the sense that it was a better outcome than watching it go to a party who would run it wrong. He had been thinking for the past 2 years about what it should become. He said he had been looking for the right kind of tenant, someone who would take care of it, someone whose presence would be a good thing for the block, and that he had not found it yet. He said the building was 1,400 square feet on the ground floor and 800 above, and that the rent he was prepared to offer was a number that made Delia go still. It was less than half of what she was paying in Caldwell. She looked at him. He said, "I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you. I want to be plain about that. I'm doing it because I watched you make a choice last night that told me something about who you are. The kind of person who does that when it costs them something is the kind of person I'd like to have next to my store." Delia did not answer right away. She had learned over the years the difference between an offer that has conditions folded inside it and an offer that is what it says it is, and she sat with this one for a moment, turning it over. "Can I come see it?" she said. "That's why I'm here," he said. He waited while she wrote a note for the door and locked up. She followed him in her car the 50 miles back down Route 9, in broad daylight this time, the road still wet from the night before, but the sky cleared off to a pale winter blue, and she drove it at a steady clip with her hands loose on the wheel. She thought about the building. She thought about whether 1,400 square feet was more than she could manage alone. She thought about whether Rena could ride the school bus to a different stop in the mornings. She thought about small things, which is what she did when the large things were too large to hold directly. Let me ask you something before this story goes further. If you found $11 in change that wasn't yours, would you give it back? I wonder about that sometimes. It seems like a small thing. It seemed like a small thing to Delia, but small things have a way of being seen. Stay with this story. The building was on Pell Road, just off the Route 9 junction, which meant it sat at the edge of a commercial block that included Hanover's and a small diner and a post office and a farm co-op. There was parking in the back and a loading dock that still worked. The front windows were wide and clean, the kind that would show a shop's interior to anyone passing at good speed, which in Delia's experience was exactly what a shop needed to keep itself in people's minds. Vernon unlocked it and walked her through in the manner of a man who is proud of a thing but is trying not to show it, which meant he pointed out the load-bearing issues honestly, and the things that needed updating, and the one window seal that would need replacing before winter was fully out. He did not oversell it. She noticed that. She noticed other things too. She noticed that the back room had a work table bolted to the wall at the right height for cutting, and she noticed that the ceiling height in the main room was good enough for a full-length dress form without the space feeling cramped, and she noticed that the light came in from the east and the west in the afternoon, which was the light you wanted for colour work. She stood in the centre of the main room for a moment, and she looked at the ceiling and she looked at the floor, which was old hardwood, scuffed but solid. Vernon stood near the front door with his hands in his pockets. She said, "The hardwood floor. Is that original?" 1947, he said. She stood on it for another second. Then she said, "I'd need a week to think." "Take 2, he said. She took 1. On Thursday, she drove back out to Pell Road and stood in the room again alone because Vernon had left the key with her, and she walked it slowly, end to end, the way you walk a room when you are trying to understand whether it could become something that is yours. The building was quiet in a way her current space never was. The Caldwell shop sat above a dry cleaning operation, and there was always a low hum through the floor that she had stopped noticing, but that she could remember noticing. Once. And she understood, standing here in the silence, that she had adapted to it the way you adapt to a minor pain. Not gone, just filed. Here there was only the sound of her footsteps on the hardwood, and from somewhere outside, the low pass of a truck on Route 9. She sat on the work table in the back room for a while with her coat still on. She thought about the 3 years in Caldwell and the 2 before that in a smaller space 2 streets over, and she thought about the dress forms she had lined up against the wall and the signs she had painted herself in the front window, and she thought about Rena, who had been born when Delia was 29 and who had been the point of most of the decisions since. Rena's father had left when Rena was 2. He had not left badly. He had simply become a man who could not stay, and Delia had come to understand that this was a feature of who he was rather than a commentary on who she was, and she had made a kind of peace with it, the kind that takes years and works better than the kind that is claimed too quickly. She had raised Rena on the income from the shop and the 2 nights a week she spent doing alterations for a bridal house in the city, and she had made it work, and she was not ashamed of how she had made it work, even on the evenings when she was too tired to eat before she fell asleep in the chair. She sat on the work table and thought about the rent figure Vernon had named, and she did the math again, the way she had done it 4 times already, and the math still said the same thing. It said that at that rent, in a space this size, she could take on a second employee, or she could take on more inventory, or she could do both at reduced scale, and that any of those outcomes was better than the one she was currently managing in Caldwell. The math had been saying this for 4 days, and she had been checking it against itself, making sure she hadn't missed anything. She hadn't. She called Vernon that evening. She said, "I'd like to accept." He said, "Good." He asked when she wanted to start moving, and she said the end of the month, and he said that was fine. And then there was a brief silence, and he said, "My wife had a talent for sewing. She passed 4 years ago. I just want you to know I'm not unaware of what a shop like this is." Delia said, "I'm sorry about your wife." He said, "Thank you." The conversation was short. When she set the phone down, she sat in the kitchen for a while. Rena came in from the back of the apartment, still in her school clothes, and looked at her mother's face and said, "Did something happen?" Delia said, "Something good." Rena sat down across from her. Delia told her the whole thing, starting from the receipt in the parking lot, and the storm, and the 50 miles back to Hanover's, and the man who had come into the shop on Friday morning, and she told it in order, the way a story should be told. Rena listened without interrupting, which was how Rena listened to important things. When Delia was done, Rena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You drove back in that storm to return $11. "It wasn't mine," Delia said. Rena looked at her with the specific expression of a 14-year-old who is processing something they already understood as a principle, but are now seeing as a fact. "Okay," Rena said, and she meant several things at once. They moved into the Pell Road building on the last Saturday of February, which was cold and bright, the kind of day that has no weather drama, but still makes you feel like something is being inaugurated. Delia's sister Cass came and helped, and a woman from the Caldwell shop named Patricia, who had been her most reliable customer for 2 years, came and helped, and Rena carried boxes without being asked and did not complain once about the cold. They had the main room set up by 3 in the afternoon, the dress forms lined along the east wall, the cutting table anchored in the centre of the back room, the sewing machines in their places along the interior wall where the outlets were closest. The afternoon light came in from the west and caught the hardwood floor in a way that the light in the Caldwell shop had never done, because the Caldwell shop faced north and the light there had always been cool and flat, good for precision, but not for warmth. Here, the late winter sun came at a low angle through the front windows and put long, pale rectangles across the floor, and Delia stood in one of them for a moment in the middle of carrying a box, and she stopped and noticed it. Cass asked her what she was looking at. Delia said nothing. She said she was just looking. Vernon stopped by at 4:30. He brought coffee from the diner next door, 4 cups in a carrier, and he set them on the counter and said the place looked right. Delia said she thought so too. He looked at the hardwood floor in the late afternoon light. "She would have liked what you've done with it already," he said. Delia said she hoped so. He did not stay long. He shook Delia's hand and said if she needed anything in the first weeks to knock on the store's side door, and then he left. Cass watched him go and then looked at Delia with a question on her face, and Delia said, "It's not like that," and Cass said, "I didn't say it was," and they both knew the conversation was over. The shop on Pell Road opened on a Monday in early March. Delia had printed new business cards and updated the website over the weekend, and she had repainted the name on the front window herself, the same painted script, Mirrors Mend, because the name had been there since the beginning and she saw no reason to change it. The sign in the new window was slightly better than the one in Caldwell because she had more room to work with, and her hand was steadier than it had been 3 years ago. The first customer through the door that Monday was a man in his 60s with a wool coat that needed the lining replaced. He said he had driven past the store the day before and noticed the window and thought he would come in. He did not know what the window meant to Delia. He was just a man with a coat. She wrote his name on the ticket and told him it would be ready by Thursday, and she hung the coat on the rack and turned back to the table. By the end of the first month, she had more work than she had managed in any single month at the Caldwell location. Some of it came from the foot traffic off Route 9. Some of it came from the diner's customers who noticed the shop while they were waiting for a table and came in afterward. Some of it came from Hanover's, which was a busier store than it looked from the outside, drawing customers from a 40-mile radius who stocked up and stayed a while. A few of those customers, leaving with bags of hardware and seed and fence supplies, crossed the parking lot to look in the window of the shop next door, and some of them came in, and some of those became regulars. Vernon sent one customer specifically. Her name was Jo Waller, and she was in her early 50s, and she came in one Tuesday morning with a wedding dress that had belonged to her mother and had been in storage for 30 years and needed everything. Delia spent 20 minutes with the dress and then another 20 with Jo, going through what was salvageable and what would need to be replaced, and she was honest about what it would cost and honest about what the outcome would likely look like. And Jo said yes to all of it and shook Delia's hand with both of hers. The dress was cream silk, or had been once, though the silk had yellowed to a warm ivory that was not unpleasant, not something to be corrected, but something to be worked with. The bodice beading had come loose in sections, and the hem had been stepped on at some point, and the chiffon overlay had torn along 8 inches of the front. The zipper had died completely, which was common in old zippers, and the lining had separated along the sides. It was not a small job. Delia pinned the damaged sections and photographed them and wrote up everything she would need, and she told Joe she would call if anything changed as she got into it, and Joe said she trusted her, and she said it in the way that people say things when they have been told to trust someone, and found, on arriving, that the advice was sound. Joe had known Vernon for 20 years. She told Delia over the following weeks as the dress came together on the form that he was the kind of man who did not give recommendations unless he meant them. He said you were the most honest person he had met in a long time, Joe said. Delia looked up from the bodice seam. He's being generous, she said. Joe said, I don't think so. The dress took 6 weeks. When it was done, it was not exactly what it had been, because that would have been impossible, but it was something close to what it had been in spirit, which is sometimes the better thing. Joe came in on a Thursday to pick it up, and she stood in the back room while Delia held it against the light, and Joe's face did the thing that faces do when something returns to them that they had stopped expecting to see again. She said, My mother would be glad. Delia said, I think she would. That was the kind of work the shop did. It was not glamorous. It was domestic and careful and specific, and it required a person to pay attention to the thing in front of them, which was what Delia had always been able to do. There is a particular satisfaction in work that requires your full attention. It does not leave room for a great deal of the noise that fills up a life when there is no such work to do. Delia had always found this to be the case, and she found it more so now in the space on Pell Road with the hardwood floor and the good east-west light. She arrived at 7:30 in the morning, and she left by 6, and she ate lunch at the cutting table when she ate at all, and she drove home on Route 9 in the evening with a low specific satisfaction that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with the sense of a day used correctly. She thought sometimes about the night of the storm. She did not think about it with any drama. She thought about it the way you think about a straightforward decision that turned out to matter more than you could have known at the time. And she thought about how you could not have known it would matter, and how that was exactly the point. You did not return the $11 because you expected something in return. You returned it because it was not yours. That was all. And then the storm was very bad, and the drive was very long, and she had done it anyway because the doing it had already been decided before the storm got worse, and she was not in the habit of undeciding things. Rena had asked her once, earlier that spring, whether she thought things happened for a reason. They were in the car, driving back from a Saturday errand, and Rena had been looking out the window at the fields going by. Delia had thought about it. She had said, I think some things happen for a reason and some things just happen, and the tricky part is that you can't always tell which is which while they're happening. Rena had thought about this. She said, How do you know what to do then, if you can't tell? Delia said, You do the right thing regardless, then it doesn't matter which kind it turns out to be. Rena had looked at her for a moment and then looked back out the window and said, That makes sense, actually. Delia had driven on. The summer was the best the shop had had since its opening, which was not something Delia had predicted. She had made cautious projections. She was not a person who made optimistic projections. The summer exceeded the cautious ones by enough that she could afford to bring in help 2 days a week. A woman named Bertie, who had been a seamstress at a bridal house for 15 years before the house closed, and who worked with the kind of quiet speed that comes from 15 years of doing something well. Bertie called the shop a good shop, which from Bertie meant something specific. Bertie was 61 and had the hands of someone who had spent her working life at a machine, calloused at the tips and exact in their movements, and she did not need to be told how to do anything twice. She arrived at the same time each morning, and she left at the same time each evening, and she did her work in the middle of those hours without commentary, which was its own considerable quality. She and Delia had worked side by side for 3 weeks before they had a conversation that lasted more than 4 minutes, and by the time they did, they had already established the kind of working understanding that some people spend years trying to build with words. It was simply the understanding of 2 people who both knew what they were doing and respected the same things. By September, the 2-day arrangement had become 4 days, and Delia was thinking about whether 4 days might become 5. She had not had a conversation with Vernon that was longer than 10 minutes since the day she had called to accept the lease, but she saw him often enough in the parking lot in the early morning when they were both arriving, or at the diner when she went over for lunch and they had the kind of easy nod between neighbours that is not nothing, that is in fact a kind of ongoing agreement that things are going well. One morning in late September, he came into the shop. He had a pair of work trousers that needed the knee patches replaced, he said, and he said it in the tone of a man who is aware that this is a small job but wants to be a customer of the business next door. Delia wrote him a ticket and told him Tuesday. He looked around the shop. He said, "Good to see this space in use." She said it was good to be in it. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands, which she had never seen him do before. He said, "I want you to know the rent offer stands as it was. It's not going up in the next renewal. I want to be clear about that." She looked at him. He said, "You built something real here. That's worth something to the block." She said, "Thank you, Vernon." He put the hat back on. He said, "I'll see you Tuesday." After he left, Bertie looked up from the machine where she was running a hem and said, without any particular inflection, "He's a good man." Delia said, "He is." Bertie went back to the hem. The thing about dignity is that it is not loud. It does not require an audience. A person can go through a great many ordinary Thursdays carrying it, and it will not announce itself, and no one watching from outside would be able to identify the moment it was acquired or the cost at which it was held. It is simply a posture that some people maintain through difficulty, and the difficulty does not remove it, and that maintenance is not noticed most of the time by most people. It gets noticed sometimes. Rena turned 15 in October and asked for a sewing machine, which surprised Delia not at all. She had been watching Rena's hands move around the shop for months, picking things up and setting them down, asking questions about tension and grain and why a French seam held differently than a flat-felled one. Delia set up the small machine at the end of the cutting table and showed Rena the basics over 2 Saturdays, and by the 3rd Saturday, Rena was recovering a throw pillow from a pattern she had drawn herself, and she was doing it with a patience and attention that made Delia's chest go tight in a way she could not have explained to anyone who wasn't a mother. She thought about her own mother, who had taught her to sew on a machine not unlike this one, in a kitchen in a smaller town than Caldwell, when Delia was about Rena's age. She had not thought about that in a while. She let herself think about it now. Her mother had been a woman who was very good at explaining things, without making you feel like a beginner, and that was a gift Delia had tried to carry forward, and she thought she had, in some measure, and she thought she could see it passing now from her to Rena in the quality of attention Rena brought to the machine. There are things that move in one direction through time, and there are things that move in circles, and sewing was one of the things that moved in circles. November brought the pre-holiday rush, which Delia had prepared for this year in a way she had not managed to prepare for it in Caldwell because she had the space and the help and the early warning of a September that was already full. Bertie worked 5 days in November, and Delia added a third person on Saturdays, a young woman named Amber who was studying fashion and needed the hours. The shop was busy in the specific way that busy feels good, which is when the work is real and the days go somewhere. On the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, Vernon came in for his trousers. They had been ready for weeks, but he had been away, he said, visiting his son in Atlanta. He picked them up and looked at the patches and said they were good work. Delia said, "Thank you." He said, "I'm having a few people for Thanksgiving. Neighbours? You and your daughter are welcome if you don't have other plans." Delia looked at him. She said, "We usually go to my sister Cass's." "Of course," he said. "Maybe next year," she said. He nodded. He paid for the trousers and said he would see her around, and he left, and Delia stood at the counter for a moment. Then she went back to the machine where she had been working on a coat collar that needed recutting, and she picked up where she had left off. Bertie said nothing. She was the kind of woman who understood that some conversations had already said everything they needed to say. December settled over Pell Road, with a light early snow that stayed on the rooftops and not on the pavement, which was the best kind of December snow for a shop that depended on people being able to come and go easily. Delia decorated the front window with lengths of fabric she had left over from the season's projects, draped across the sill in warm reds and creams, and she put a small wreath on the door, and she left the inside light on until 8, because the window looked best from the parking lot after dark when the fabric caught the light and the painted script glowed, and the whole thing read, she thought, like exactly what it was. On the last Friday before Christmas, after Bertie and Amber had gone home and Rena had come by after school and was sitting in the back room with her machine and a scrap project, a woman came into the shop near closing. She was older, in her 70s, wearing a good winter coat that had been resoled Delia could see at least twice. She said she had been going to Hanover's for 30 years. She said she had noticed the shop next door when it changed hands back in the spring and had been meaning to come in. She had a coat. She took it out of the bag she was carrying and set it on the counter. It was old. It was a very good coat once, navy wool with a structured collar, and it had been repaired before, she said, but not for many years, and she said she did not know if it was worth the trouble. Delia took the coat and turned it over in her hands. She looked at the lining and the seams and the buttons. She could see what it had been when it was new. She said, "It's worth it." The woman looked at her. Delia said, "I can have it back to you before Christmas. It'll take a few days, but I can do it." The woman said, "I didn't think anyone still knew how to do this kind of work." Delia said, "We do." She wrote the ticket and hung the coat on the rack and walked the woman to the door. The parking lot was lit by the glow from Hanover's and by the light from the shop window, and the light from the window fell across the wet pavement in the shape of the painted script, backwards from outside, but readable if you knew what it said. The woman said, before she got to her car, "The window looks nice." Delia said, "Thank you." She went back inside and stood at the counter for a moment, and she listened to the small sound of Rena's machine running in the back room, steady and even, the way a machine sounds when the person at it has learned to trust it. She turned the shop light off, except for the display lamp in the window. She pulled on her coat. She thought about the night of the storm. Briefly, the way you think about something that is both ordinary and not. A 50-mile drive. $11. A man she had not seen in the store who had been standing near the back, watching, filing away what he saw. She had not done it to be watched. She would have done it if no one was there. That was the only version of herself she knew how to be, and she had been that version consistently enough through enough ordinary Thursdays that it had become simply what she was. She picked up her keys. She called back to Rena. 5 minutes, she said. Rena called back, I know. Delia stood for a moment by the front door, looking at the room. The dress forms in their row, the cutting table with its ruled edge, the machine stands with their spools in order, the hardwood floor going back to the rear wall in the low light. She thought it was a good room. She thought it had been a good year. Then she turned off the display lamp and went to get her daughter, and they went home.